Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Mehlaka Samdani. I am the Director of Critical Connections, a nonprofit organization here in Massachusetts that builds community awareness and empowerment around issues affecting American Muslims and other targeted communities. So earlier this month, we commemorated the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which killed almost 3,000 innocent Americans. This year also marks the 20th anniversary of the global war on terror that was launched as a result of the 9/11 attacks under the leadership of George W. Bush, although this has continued over successive administrations. According to the Cost of War Project at Brown University, this war has cost the US more than $8 trillion and has killed approximately 900,000 people. Today, we're going to take stock of this so-called war on terror, the laws and policies that emerged as a result of it, both foreign and domestic, and examine their impact on national security, civil rights, and US foreign policy. To help us understand the legacy and lessons of the past 20 years, we are joined by an incredible group of panelists, and I'm excited to introduce them to you today. So first, we have Professor Sahar Aziz, whose scholarship examines the intersection of national security, race, religion, and civil rights with a focus on the adverse impact of national security laws and policies on racial, religious, and ethnic minorities. She is the author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, and the founding director of the Center for Security, Race and Rights at Rutgers University. Next, we have Dr. Nazia Kazi, who is an anthropologist and educator based in Philadelphia. Her work explores the role of Islamophobia and racism in the context of global politics. She is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Stockton University in New Jersey, where she teaches courses on race, ethnicity, immigration, and Islam in the US. She is the author of Islamophobia, Race and Global Politics, which is out now from Rowman and Littlefield. Dr. Muqtedar Khan is the professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. He researches and teaches Islam, governance, and international relations. He is the author of Islam and Good Governance, a political philosophy of Ihsan by Palgrave 2019, which has been recognized as one of the best all-time books on political philosophy by the nonfiction book portal Book Authority. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure to have you all here. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sahar and ask her to sort of discuss some of the counterterrorism laws and policies that emerged in the wake of 9/11 and their legal and societal implications, both here in the US and abroad. Thank you, Sahar.
Thank you so much. And I will just preface my comments by saying these are comments that come from my forthcoming book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, and I'll put more information in the chat later in the talk. So I'm going to focus on the part that focuses on what I call criminalizing Muslim identity. Okay, so racialization criminalizes Muslim identity, and presumptions that Muslims are more prone to terrorism inform US national security policies and practices. The consequent harms to Muslim communities range from direct employment discrimination, violent hate crimes, and denial of new mosque constructions to indirect chilling effects, wherein surveillance and anti-terrorism prosecutions cause Muslims to hide their religious identity or circumscribe how they practice their faith in public. Hence, being Muslim in the post-9/11 era imposes forms of subordination not currently experienced by other religious minorities. Some of the stereotypes of Jews, Catholics, and Mormons in the early 20th century apply today to what I call the racial Muslim. And these stereotypes include being disloyal, anti-democratic, and unfit for self-governance. The material consequences, however, differ depending on the historical context and predominance of certain stereotypes associated with a particular faith community. So in the case of racial Muslims, the US government interacts with Muslim communities exclusively through a security lens. A case in point is government-sponsored community outreach programs. Although described as initiatives to educate Muslims about the law and their rights, in practice, the various agencies conducting such meetings across the country are tasked with countering radicalization, to which the racial Muslim is presumed to be inherently susceptible. Tellingly, no such community outreach is conducted in conservative Christian or right-wing white communities as a means of countering the rise of right-wing extremism by white males, notwithstanding the documented rise in white right-wing extremism and the unprecedented siege of the US Capitol on January 6, 2021. Moreover, national security and immigration laws that are neutral on their face are selectively enforced against Muslims, particularly what I call the religious dissident racial Muslim and the religious racial Muslim. So as a result, Muslims are the primary targets of counterterrorism surveillance, investigations, and prosecutions. They are singled out for heightened screening at airports and inclusion on terrorist watch lists. They are over-policed through mass surveillance, material support to terrorism prosecutions, and countering violent extremism programs. And Muslims are tracked down in immigration enforcement and aim to root out so-called potential terrorists. Now, the USA Patriot Act, the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, also called NSEERS, and the Absonder program are among the myriad national security laws and immigration initiatives granting the US government expansive authority in the securitization of Muslims. Abroad, the US government has kidnapped and tortured Muslims in secret rendition programs. It has assassinated Muslims with drones and indefinitely detained Muslims at the Guantanamo Bay detention camp in Cuba. These authoritarian practices occur without concern for religious liberty because their targets are perceived as a dangerous race, not a religious minority. Despite qualifiers that such practices are reserved only for quote unquote radical Muslims, all Muslims are potential targets of the 9/11 counterterrorism regime. Now, some degree of public approval is required for the government to engage in these racial projects against a religious minority. Otherwise, the government would be accused of eroding American religious freedom rights. Due in large part to a well-financed Islamophobia industry and negative media portrayals of Muslims, public opinion of Muslims has remained low for nearly 2 decades. This trend will continue so long as a critical mass of Americans views Islam as a violent political ideology and Muslims as a collective security threat. With each passing year since 2001, polls have shown public opinion turning against Muslims. In stark contrast, pre-9/11 polls found that 64% of Americans were either unable or unwilling to describe their view of Islam as favorable or unfavorable because they knew too little about the religion. While consumers of the Islamophobia industry's propaganda were initially limited to right-wing Christian nationalists or right-wing Zionist circles, as the demand for information about Islam and Muslims grew after 9/11, anti-Muslim narratives went mainstream. Now, influenced by this constant flow of anti-Muslim discourse, some Americans believe they are patriotic when they vandalize mosques, shoot Muslims, harass Muslim co-workers, and demand that Muslims, quote, go home, presumed to be a foreign country. A little over half of Americans also support the government's increasing surveillance of mosques and other places where Muslims gather. Likewise, they see profiling of Muslims in airports and counterterrorism sting operations as smart national security. Now, I just want to briefly conclude with the Muslim racial hierarchy that I discuss in my book to show how not all Muslims are treated the same and that the securitization process is very much associated with Muslims or a group of Muslims' religiosity, and specifically, their political dissent or disagreement with U.S. foreign policy in Muslim majority countries. So with capacity, the primary restraint on government overreach, officials must prioritize which Muslims to target first. The criteria tend to be religiosity and dissident politics. Thus, the religious dissident racial Muslim represents everything the US government, whether controlled by Democrats or Republicans, deems inassimilable and antithetical to American liberalism. Indeed, FBI agents have admitted that the radicalization model they are trained to follow, quote, suggests that Muslims harshly criticizing US foreign policy or sympathizing with radicalism are terrorists in waiting who will eventually progress to violence, end quote. Next in line are religious racial Muslims whose religiosity the state views as a vulnerability to foreign terrorist recruitment, followed by the secular dissident racial Muslim, whose vocal critiques of US policy threaten to expose the racist underpinnings of US national security practices. And finally, the secular racial Muslim stands the best chance of being tolerated by liberals and Christian conservatives as the model minority. Now, immigrant Muslims whose Islamic faith animates their principled opposition to America's support for Muslim dictators, occupation of Muslim lands, and Israeli occupation of Palestinians are precisely those who the US government wants to expel and ban from the country. Should they rise to power, as is the case with Representatives Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, they can more meaningfully challenge these longstanding American policies. For example, Representatives Omar and Tlaib refused to sign a US House resolution reaffirming support for a two-state solution because it failed to condemn annexation of Palestinian land in the West Bank, Israeli settlement expansion on Palestinian land, demolition of Palestinian housing in East Jerusalem, and deportation of human rights activists. They also joined a group of progressive Democrats in May 2021, introducing a congressional resolution to halt weapons sales to Israel because of its human rights abuses of Palestinians. This is an unprecedented political move that now feeds Islamophobic tropes that Muslims and Arabs are anti-Semitic when they challenge Israeli state policy. So this is just to give you kind of a taste of not only what the government does in terms of national security policies, but also who it targets and who it prioritizes. And I think the key takeaway is to ask ourselves whether we in fact do have free speech rights, whether we in fact do have religious freedom rights, when the people who are not the insiders, who are not the majority, who are not in the dominant group, do not experience those rights. And that if the only reason you're experiencing those rights is because you're in the mainstream and therefore you've never had to actually exercise those rights, then that should cause us to pause and ask, do we really have those rights? Because it's only when we look at the outsiders, the minorities, the subordinated groups within our society and see how they're treated, that we will discover whether or not we have meaningful rights or simply rights on paper. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sahar. I'm sure there'll be many follow-up questions to that. And thank you for sticking to your time. And that's really wonderful. So I think we're going to move along and I would ask Dr. Nazia Kazi now to sort of talk about the role of race in the global war on terror in both the domestic and foreign policy realms.
Thank you so much, Mehlaka, always for having such interesting events with really important and timely conversations, and it's an honor to be here. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of a reflection about something I notice in my classrooms, and I've been teaching in the university classroom, for about 14 years now, and specifically about matters of race and racism. And this is true, I think, of sort of Americans writ large. Is when you ask Americans, or my students for that matter, to define racism, they will typically offer definitions that suggest that racism is a kind of prejudice toward racial others. It is a dislike or fear of people who are different from oneself. They'll nowadays often throw around this word microaggressions. In other words, the popular understanding of race in America is what I call attitudinal. People think racism resides in someone's heart and mind. So rarely do Americans, when they are asked what is racism, offer material definitions. And by material, I mean things that we can measure through the allocation of resources, status, power, and wealth. Rarely do people suggest that the likelihood that one's water has lead in it is an instance of racism, though we know, after witnessing what happened in Flint, Michigan, that it certainly is. Rarely do people suggest the likelihood of arrest for a low-level nonviolent drug offense as an instance of racism, though we know from our look at the war on drugs that it absolutely is. And we can extend this to our understanding of Islamophobia. The mainstream understanding of both Islamophobia and the attempts to counter it have been focused on changing attitudes rather than material realities. This is why I'm sure many of you have heard of, interfaith dialogue events, Ramadan being explained to non-Muslims, its significance, a lot of reminders that come from Muslim American communities about the importance or the role of hijab for Muslim women, the significance of the Hajj in the lives of Muslims. In other words, quite often, the approach to combating Islamophobia has been to combat people's prejudices and attitudes. The assumption being that if ordinary people's perceptions changed, that racism or Islamophobia would crumble. Now, of course, whether you think racism is attitudinal versus material crucially impacts what your solutions to it will be. So if you think racism is a matter of people's prejudices and preferences, well, then the solutions might be holding, racial sensitivity workshops, which I'm sure many of us have endured in our workplaces. It might be to have trainings about, cultural competency. It might be diversity and equity initiatives. These would be the solutions you would propose if you truly believed that racism was a matter of attitudes and preferences. But if you believe racism is material, then your solutions look entirely different. And they look like changing the ways wealth, status, and authority are distributed in a society. One thing that always strikes me when we look back at September 11th, 2001, now 20 years behind us, is we often appropriately understand it as a political event, right? An act of terrorism. But we often don't understand it as an economic event. And let's be clear, 9/11 was a distinctly economic event. Immediately after September 11th, 2001, the approval ratings of President Bush, who of course had not won the election, but had won appointment by the Supreme Court, his approval rating soared. It went to record highs of any US president in recent history. And I'll remind you that on September 10th, 2001, he was deeply unpopular. Now, this popularity afforded him a lot, because we know that in the weeks and months that followed September 11th, 2001, which I'm now referring to as an economic event, the economic system in the US was restructured in ways that lined the pockets of the elite, right? We saw a tax bill that basically gave huge cuts to the ultra wealthy. We saw a stimulus package for America's ultra wealthy. We saw an airline bailout package for corporate executives in the airline industry while they were laying off record numbers of their workers. I mean, September 11th was absolutely a moment in which sort of the ruling elite in America could reshuffle the economy in ways that benefited them, because we, the American public, were too distracted, right? Too distracted by the fear of another imminent terrorist attack. And so this is a crucial feature of understanding September 11th, 2001. I think we have to understand it as a moment that made us more unequal as a country along lines of race and class. So this response to Islamophobia, this sort of mainstream response that aims to correct people's perceptions, it really flourished in the post-9/11 moment. And some people refer to the post-9/11 moment as sort of the spirit of 9/12. This is a term that comes from the conservative radio commentator Glenn Beck, who spoke of the spirit of 9/12 as this moment of unity, national unity, where Americans came together after September 11th. And certainly, as Hillary Clinton would later refer to the spirit of 9/12 as something she too celebrated, Americans did kind of come together in certain ways. They came together to support the expansion of the US military-industrial complex. Often they came together to support the US rollback of our civil liberties. And they came together to unite against a nebulous foreign Muslim threat. I mean, this to me was the spirit of 9/12. And of course, it played out in all kinds of settings. In US media, I find it interesting how the spirit of 9/12 played out in public schools across the country. We know, for instance, that Arab and Muslim students faced all kinds of disciplinary measures. And kids across the country, young elementary school students, were using art as a way to process the events of 9/11. But it was only the Muslim and Arab students who drew the scenes at Ground Zero, who were pulled aside and pulled into the principal's office. One Palestinian high school student was talking to a classmate said something about a tourist. The teacher heard the word terrorist, and the disciplinary action taken against the student was so harsh, he had to bring a lawsuit against his school to have it removed. I mean, this was a moment when schools were really restructuring themselves as sites of nationalism and patriotism. Laws were passed across the country that forced schools to fly, God bless America banners. So this was the spirit of 9/12 that I find really important, that we ought to think about when we think about the aftermath, the immediate racial aftermath of September 11th, 2001. I mean, of course, we can also look at sort of the Obama presidency and the Trump presidency as interesting lenses with which to interpret Islamophobia. Of course, Obama had the accusations cast against him that he was a secret Muslim. And what he did to address these accusations was deny them, rather than to remind the American public that there wouldn't be anything wrong with having a Muslim president anyway. But Obama walked a fine line. I mean, we know that Obama spoke very fondly of Muslims and Muslim civilization, for instance, at his speech in Cairo to the Muslim world. We know that he hosted iftar dinners for Muslim Americans at the White House. But we also know he created and expanded a system of drone warfare that, through the racist designation of adult Muslim men as enemy combatants, sort of singled out Muslims as guilty no matter what, unable to be counted as civilians. And this is really crucial. I mean, even Bush, right, the architect of the war on terror, reminded the American public after 9/11 to be kind to your Muslim neighbors. He spoke at mosques. So there's this interesting coexistence of the gestures, sort of the pageantry of inclusion of Muslims that coexists with some of the most brutal forms of anti-Muslim racism that we see. And for me, this is really crucial for making sense of sort of the anti-Muslim landscape that we see in the world around us. So I will leave it there, and I can't wait for a discussion. It's always very lively here. So looking forward to that.
Thank you so much, Nazia. So I am now going to turn to Dr. Khan. Dr. Khan, he is going to speak about US foreign policy and what lessons perhaps the foreign policy elite have learned over the past 20 years.
So Mehlaka, thank you very much for hosting this excellent event and inviting me to speak on this important event, historical commemoration. I also want to thank both Sahar and Nazia for such excellent presentations. I'm going to basically try to do in 10 minutes something which is very difficult, which is try to understand and explain US foreign policy responses after September 11th. There are two things that I want to say about US response to 9/11. Number one, for the American security elite, the people who are part of the American foreign policy establishment on both sides of the party, the military-industrial complex, etc. This was a huge shock what happened. This was a unipolar moment. America was unchallenged internationally. The Soviet Union had collapsed. So there was nobody that could compete with America militarily, economically, and the international system more or less reflected values which were conducive to America's hegemony. So in its moment of extreme primacy, the US was attacked as never before. So this failure for a security failure came as a huge shock to the security establishment. They were shaken at the core. That was the instant response, and not understanding fully as to what was going to be the extent of this attack, etc. The initial reactions were essentially being shocked at the vulnerability of the United States at the moment when it thought it was uniquely powerful, the most powerful state in the history, and then it was attacked in such spectacular fashion. And the second point that I want to make is that we have had huge discussions about what led to it and what we should do about it. And I remember in those days, I was an assistant professor on the margins of this discussion, trying to get a word in. But one thing that seemed apparent was that the American foreign policy elite was neither willing to acknowledge nor understand that September 11th attack was a consequence to the United States global hegemony. The US was practicing a sense of domination in many parts of the world, including the Muslim world, and this asymmetrical response to America's domination, particularly in the Middle East, was a reaction to American foreign policy. They wanted to see it as completely different, nothing to do with American foreign policy. And therefore, because there was no acknowledgement that our foreign policy may have contributed in some ways to what happened on September 11, we simply doubled down and just put the same foreign policy on steroids. So what we were doing before 9/11, which is in technical terms, we say extra-regional hegemony was being practiced by the US, especially in the Middle East and South Asia and the Muslim world. We simply doubled down on that. So there were a range of explanations trying to explain what really caused September 11, why did 9/11 happen? The first explanation was, it is the fault of Islam. Islam as a religion, Islam as a civilization. So you heard of the clash of civilizations argument, which was made by Sam Huntington, initially advanced by Bernard Lewis. So they said, look, this prophecy of the clash of civilizations is coming true. Islam is to blame. Islam is a religion which is anachronistic. It has not adjusted to the modern world, nation states, democracy, modernity, gender rights, etc. So it is Islam's fault, and 9/11 is essentially an expression of Muslims' inability to come to terms with modernity. The second explanation was that, well, it's not actually Islam. They're all very friendly Muslims, especially with the US, etc. There are moderate Muslims, there are secular Muslims, etc. The problem is with what we call as radical Islam, not all of Islam. So radical Islam is anti-West, anti-Israel, anti-women, anti-human rights, anti-democracy. And so essentially what caused September 11 was a clash of ideologies between the neoliberalism that the US was pushing, democracy, human rights, open markets, and whatever radical Islam was to them. The third explanation was saying, well, this is a failure of Arab states. Dictators, they haven't provided any benefit to their populations, so the disenchantment of Arab populations, especially in states like Egypt, is the reason why there is terrorism, broadly speaking, and the 9/11 is essentially an attempt to exclude the US from the Middle East so that there can be reforms in the Arab states. And then the fourth explanation was the US foreign policy is to blame. And there were these people like John Esposito and others, and I was in this camp to a great extent saying, look, it's our foreign policy which is to blame, and we need to rectify, we need to have a reformed foreign policy. It's not about Islam, it's about US foreign policy, the way we engage. So for example, Saddam Hussein was a dictator for decades, but there were no suicide bombing in Iraq, but the US shows up and then we have suicide bombings. The same in Afghanistan. There were no suicide bombings in Afghanistan during the entire war with the Soviet Union. The US shows up and then we see terrorism. So there's something to do with US foreign policy, which needs to be critically discussed. And then the final explanation was that, well, it's nothing to do with Islam or idea. It's about capitalism and globalization, the winners and losers of globalization. And Nazia kind of explained this position quite brilliantly as to how we can understand September 11th as essentially a rejection of the economic order of the world, not just in the US, but globally also. So who were these people who were saying these things? So the way I characterize them is the people who blamed Islam were the conservatives, people who blame radical Islam were the neocons. The failure of Arab states was attributed by the realists. And then academics who were more on the liberal side of the politics started talking about US foreign policy and the need to reform US foreign policy. And then there were the what we call as progressive left, which was talking about capitalism and globalization as a reason why September 11th really happened. So I have done an extensive study of this. There's so much literature out there on 9/11 that it is not possible. So I actually did a report. I want to show it to you. It's called these 5 perspectives on Islam by US. And so I took the work of Bernard Lewis to understand how Islam was blamed for 9/11. Daniel Pipes is the poster child of the neocons who try to blame what people like Ted Cruz and others today use the phrase radical Islam to imply. And then it was Fareed Zakaria who basically talked about the states. He's a realist thinker, and he wanted basically reform of Arab states as a solution. It was John Esposito and his group of liberal academics who really made the case that American foreign policy was essentially responsible for this. And then, of course, Edward Said is one of the persons who talked about the inequities as a result of globalization that resulted in September 11. Edward Said did not live too long after that, so he was not very prominent, but there were other economists and others who did make this point consistently, but I chose to speak about Edward Said more as a homage to him than anything else. But what were their solutions? So when Bernard Lewis says Islam is the problem, the solution was to reform Islam. Islam must reform in order to make itself compatible with contemporary times or the American hegemonic order. People like the neocons basically were more interested in two things, the regime change and also destroying and eliminating political Islam and radical Islam. So the thing that we have to understand is, as far as the American foreign policy elite was, they were not only worried about the fact that America had suddenly been, its vulnerabilities had been exposed by non-state actors, but also that America's hegemony was being questioned. So their response really of the neocons was that, look, this is a great opportunity to go back and reform the world and reassert American empire and America's hegemony worldwide. And so let's go into Iraq and other places and establish regimes which are willing to carry water for the United States in the region. So essentially, it became as reassertion and empire building exercise rather than ensuring that the US will remain secure. So even the war in Afghanistan was not just about going after Al-Qaeda, but also creating a forward base from which US hegemony could be projected, US power could be projected in the region, South Asia and the Middle East. And then you have people like Fareed Zakaria who understood that the neocons were trying to do and said that is not in the interest of the US. What we need to do is essentially democratize the Arab world, especially Egypt and other states. But the liberals continued to say, look, US foreign policy is the problem. If you continue to be hegemonic and so aggressive, waging wars which are unjustified and even illegal, the war in Iraq was definitely illegal. You know, Jon Stewart said something very incredible about the war in Iraq. He said the next country America is going to attack is Canada, because Canada is exactly like Iraq. It has nothing to do with 9/11 and has no weapons of mass destruction. And so the academics were making this point that what the US needs to do is not only rethink its foreign policy, but also to genuinely allow democratic movements in the Middle East, particularly political Islamic movements like the Ikhwan al-Muslimin and others, which were non-violent and pro-democracy, to thrive and to grow and not try to crush the only democratic movements in the Muslim world in the name of radical Islam. And then, of course, the discussion about reforming capitalism. It is only now with the rise of Bernie Sanders that we are seeing a little bit more serious discussion of left-leaning policy with Elizabeth Warren and others. But during 9/11, in this aftermath in Washington, this particular perspective did not get much attention, even though in academia it did have much voice. So the global war on terror essentially was supposed to do two things. It was to end terrorism, eliminate Al-Qaeda, and other security threats, and also reestablish US hegemony. So we went into Afghanistan to go after Al-Qaeda, but also the public demanded some kind of a military response to a military attack. And so Afghanistan was the target, and it was justifiable in many ways because Al-Qaeda was based there and so on. But the Iraq war was just about reasserting US hegemony, not only in the Middle East and the larger Muslim world, but also to let the rest of the world know how powerful America is. And so the shock and awe strategy was not just to shock and awe Iraq, but also to shock and awe China and Russia, etc. So it was basically an exercise in reestablishing American empire whose vulnerabilities were exposed. Ironically, 20 years later, the Taliban have done in the same spectacular fashion, expose the vulnerability and limits of US military by basically kicking the US out of Afghanistan. So the US foreign policy report card, as a result of September 11, I think these are the points that I have. You can judge to give it a pass, fail, A, B, C, D, or E. One, it did diminish Al-Qaeda, no doubt about it. Number two, it enhanced counterterrorism capabilities. The US has new technologies, and as Sahar pointed out, a new legal system which helps it target whoever they deem as terrorists. I hope that some of these enhanced counterterrorism capabilities will serve the United States as we combat white nationalism and white terrorism, which we saw show itself on January 6th in such a spectacular fashion. But the same foreign policy also gave birth to ISIS. It destabilized the Arab world and South Asia. It even destabilized the United States. So even though we may not have external terrorism threats, but we have extremely high levels of internal terrorism threats. We could have had a situation where extremists could have lynched our vice president right there on television. And he was lucky that Pence got away with it. But one of the bigger consequences is the rise of global Islamophobia. This is a direct consequence of the US response to 9/11. And it is going to create a lot of disharmony, not just in the US, but also in Europe and in India also, where tropes have been generated which are now used to demonize Islam and Muslims and justify policies which marginalize them and undermine their human rights. But one final thing that has happened as a result of September 11, that the United States is now a much weaker state, both militarily and economically, but it's also not as respected and as admired world over as it used to be in the past. So in the sense that it has become a weaker state in the material sense, and in the ideational sense, its hegemony is also weakened. I have two papers whose I will share the link, this report, which is available as a PDF free, and this article, which talks about post-Orientalism and geopolitics, the debates after 9/11, which shaped US foreign policy. I will share the links in the chat with all of those who are interested in it. And one final thing, I have a YouTube channel called Conversations. Please subscribe to it if you like to listen to the kind of things I talk about. And Melika, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Khan, for that very comprehensive analysis. It's been so refreshing listening to all three of you. And before we turn it over to audience Q&A, I'm wondering if you would like to respond to one another, the panelists, if there was anything that came up that this would be a time, we're sort of creating that space right now for you to do that. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask our audience to please submit your questions in the chat function. And we'll try and get to as many questions as possible. So if anybody would like to respond, that would be great. Sahar and Nazia.
I'll just say something. I wanted to clarify. So when Professor Khan mentioned the legal or strengthening counterterrorism, one thing to keep in mind is that we didn't create that many new laws. We expanded some pre-existing laws. So for example, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act already existed. It was passed into law in the 1970s. Actually, as a response to Watergate and as a response to COINTELPRO, the FBI's program targeting African Americans and anti-Vietnam War activists in the 60s and 70s. But what we did is we lowered the threshold that allowed, for example, the FBI to use the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant powers. And similarly, special registration has always been in our immigration code. I wrote an article called A Muslim Registry: the Precursor to Internment, that goes through the history of special registration of immigrants, non-immigrants. So these are people who are here but not on green cards. And that was already on the books. Similarly, sting operations, selective enforcement, racialization of the criminal justice system, especially when its enforcement has been around since criminal justice since the country's been around. So one of the things that I discovered as I was researching the legal regime was that we expanded existing laws and we lowered thresholds that limited some of the authorities. The same, by the way, the same limitations that were set in the 1970s. So you're seeing the pendulum swing. In the 70s, the government tightened and passed new laws because of the abuses of the FBI from the 50s and 60s. And then what the Patriot Act did is loosen some of them. Now, we did have a few new things, such as the FBI could come and do a sneak and peek warrant, which is they come into your house, they search it, and they leave, and you never know that they're there. And they do have a warrant for that. And that came under the Patriot Act. So there were a few things, but ultimately what I think is important to take away from the legal component is that the abuses really came from interpretations and enforcement of pre-existing laws that were blatantly dismissive and discounting of civil liberties of Muslims and Arabs. And so I think the solution is not simply to change the law. I think the solution lies much more in similar to what Professor Kazi said, it's a social problem, right? It's very, very deeply baked into our psyche and in our culture.
Can I quickly add something, Melika? I had a very strange problem a few years ago. I wrote an op-ed after the election of Hamas. I think it was in 2006 or 7. I wrote an article saying election of Hamas, good for everybody. And the point that I made was that it was Nixon who went to China to make peace, remember? So using that analogy, I argued that if Israel could make peace with Hamas, then nearly everybody in the Muslim world would accept this peace, including Iran. So you have a very good opportunity now that you have a Hamas government to negotiate and make peace. And I was harassed for more than 2 years because apparently there was a legal interpretation that providing material support to terrorism is terrorism. And my op-ed was considered as a material support to terrorism. So I was told point blank on my face that if you tell a terrorist, if you advise a terrorist to give up terrorism, that can be interpreted as material support for terrorism. So I had an incredibly bad time. I said, this is ridiculous. And I just got lucky that the article was published in Haaretz. And so my lawyer interpreted that as I was advising Israel. And so the judge accepted that argument. So to me, I mean, I don't understand the full scope of the Patriot Act, but I do understand that some of the standards were really drastically reduced. And I actually wrote an article saying that several elements of the the Bill of Rights, especially the 4th and the 1st, were clearly suspended, at least for Muslims after 9/11. We did not enjoy all the 10 amendments to the Constitution, and it is like this. I don't think people who were on January 6th rampaging, we are charging them with violation of public property. And if they were Muslims, we would have drawn them.
Can I just want to answer your question in case others want to know this. So there's a case called the Humanitarian Law Project, which came before the Supreme Court. I want to say, I think it's around 2010, 2011. Anyway, and I'll put the link. Effectively what that found, so these material support to terrorism laws were passed in 1996 under Clinton. And they were passed in response to Hamas rejecting the Oslo agreements. And so this is pre 9/11. And the Humanitarian Law Project's, the Supreme Court case in that said that as long as your training and expertise and special knowledge is provided independently without direction or coordination with a designated group, then it's not material support. But if, for example, you had been in contact with someone from Hamas, or there had been any coordination of publishing that op-ed, you are correct. You could have been criminally liable. But I'll send the decision. It's really, really problematic, and it essentially chills any kind of advocacy on behalf of human rights, particularly in conflict zones where there are designated terrorist groups like in Gaza, like in parts of Sri Lanka when the Tamil Tigers were active, like in Yemen where Al-Qaeda is active. So that is certainly, but that's not related to the Patriot Act.
I think it's safe to assume that Dr. Khan had not coordinated with Hamas when he wrote that line.
That's why I'm still
so yes, exactly.
But
So
I'm just telling you that's how thin the line is.
Wow, that's great. So Nazia, I think, did you want to say something before we turn it over to audience questions?
No, I'm ready to dive right into that.
Okay, excellent. So our first question is from Rabbi Deborah Jacobson, and I believe this is directed to Dr. Khan, but anybody can answer. Can you talk more specifically about terrorism as a response to US foreign policy, especially in the Middle East? What policies in particular do you see that increased terrorism?
So for example, I didn't use the word terrorism. I said asymmetrical responses to United States domination. So when we bomb cities and kill civilians, it's called shock and awe. When others do that, it is terrorism. So for example, what's happening in the Middle East with regard to Palestinians, we are suffocating them. We will not allow them any which way to work towards their rights. So for example, if they use military force, we call them terrorists. If they do boycotts, we go after them legally. We are going after companies which will boycott Israel. We go after academics who criticize Israel. There are more than 300 articles on the web attacking me for saying things like what I'm saying right now. So there is this effort to completely chill and put people in boxes. So this is what I mean by hegemonic policies, where you will not allow the weaker party to have any opportunity to pursue their legitimate self-interests. And that is what the US was doing in the Middle East. We had control over their economy. We were the biggest suppliers of weapons. At the time of 9/11, nearly 80% of the weapons market was the US. The US was selling F-16s to everybody in the region. I mean, if we were for peace in the Middle East, then the best way would be not to provide weapons to the parties which could potentially fight. Give them sticks, so let them fight with sticks, not with bombs and rockets and missiles. So the US foreign policy has been one of asserting complete domination, not just in the security arena, but in the economic and social arena too. So that is why they were pushing back at it. So for example, we went into Afghanistan, fine, I was in the favor of catching bin Laden and hanging him right there in the football team and then coming back by December 2002. But we stayed there and tried to reform them, etc., try to convey the message that we are a benevolent hegemon, and now suddenly we drop. What happened to women's rights? Now we don't care about it? I mean, so this whole idea that we cared about rights and democracy in Afghanistan, so we were there. So these kinds of policies, which makes the other people feel less, is, I think, a very important thing. During the Arab Spring, I attended many of the protests in many parts of the Arab world, and one of the things that they were saying repeatedly was that this was a struggle for dignity. This was a struggle for dignity. They did not feel as if they were being treated as human beings in their own country and elsewhere. And that is an important point. And I think those are the kind of policies. Even today, we are supporting dictatorships in Egypt. And our president then goes about saying that foreign policy is the core, democracy and human rights are the core of our foreign policy. But he never talks about the rights of Palestinians or even Indian Muslims now in India. You know, we are going ahead with all these security and hegemonic policies.
Nazia, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, if folks in attendance have not yet, definitely check out Chalmers Johnson's book, Blowback. There's also an article length version, I think it was on The Nation several years ago. And what he lays out in his book is this term blowback, which is itself a CIA term, and the term blowback is meant to refer to the unintended consequences of US foreign policy decisions. I mean, of course, right? 9/11 itself could be understood as blowback par excellence. I mean, really, here we see the US's Cold War chickens coming home to roost, really. And that line is so easily drawn. But there's far more to be said than just September 11th. I mean, we can think about, for instance, the US's project of military basing around the world. And if folks haven't read David Vine's new book, The United States of War, it is a must read. I mean, 800 military bases that the US has set up around the world. Of course, no foreign country has a military base on US soil, which is interesting. But what's even more interesting, of course, is that these bases are the greatest polluters on planet Earth. In the history of humanity, the US military is the biggest polluter to have existed. I mean, this certainly breeds a kind of resentment in the people who see military bases constructed in their countries, right, around the world. So when we think about blowback, we really have to be very nuanced in understanding just how far-reaching it is. You know, I'm thinking about, for instance, the program of providing school books to Afghani children. This was a CIA project done by the CIA's front group, USAID. And this was during the Cold War, when the CIA basically printed jihadi workbooks, as they were called, and circulated them among Afghani children. So the CIA created these books where it was like, A is for Allah, okay, J is for jihad, or the math problems would ask, you know, the students to calculate the arc of a rocket fired by the Soviets into a mujahideen camp. These were school books that were used to teach Afghani school children math, literacy, etc. And because of the educational crisis that persists in a war-torn country like Afghanistan, these school books are still being used. So I think it's really important to think about this when you hear you know, the US foreign policy establishment worrying, hand-wringing about Islamic fundamentalism, for instance. I mean, this really should help us interpret what Bush himself said in the days following September 11, 2001, when he said, well, you know, why do they hate us? They hate our freedoms. That was the answer we were given as the American public, that these attacks simply occurred because those people over there are jealous, you know, that we get to wear bathing suits on the beach or whatnot. Completely erasing just decades of the geopolitics that, you know, Professor Khan has so aptly described. So definitely do check out Blowback if you haven't already. It's really enlightening.
Can I also add something?
Sure.
So I think it's really important, especially when we have an American audience here, is for us to take responsibility and ownership over our country's actions. And oftentimes what we do is especially when we talk about foreign affairs, it's as if it's somebody else's government, it's somebody else's taxpayer money, it's somebody else's elected officials doing these things, which we may, let's say, presumably we agree are not effective or are not moral or not humane. And I think one of the missing links in a lot of these conversations is our own sense of responsibility and indignation and outrage that all of this is happening in our name. And we have a lot of agency in contrast to people who are being targeted for drones, in contrast to people who are citizens of authoritarian states who are supported directly by our government and through our taxpayer dollar. And we do live in a democracy. It's not a perfect democracy, but it's, for practical purposes, a democracy in terms of allowing us to speak and dissent and protest and mobilize and vote people out, vote people in. And so I think that's really important, that if you truly do care about these issues, if you're upset about them, if you find them to be unacceptable, is that you have to get involved in these issues by communicating, at the very least, communicating with your elected official through letters or through calls. And then obviously you can do more, whether it's when someone's running for office, that you let them know, I care about these things. I want you to stop doing this. I don't want you to support these policies. Because at the end of the day, there are many politicians, for better or worse, are just trying to get reelected. There aren't that many that are pure ideologues. And that can be, again, a blessing and a curse, but our political system is corrupted by money, right? And by special interest groups. And so effectively you have to become a special interest group, not necessarily a wealthy one, but you can do it through numbers by demanding that our foreign policy needs to change in these specific ways.
Thank you, Sahar. You've described it quite well. We actually have a question, and you've sort of started answering that question, but I also want to let Dr. Khan or Nazia respond as well. Ka writes, you have described the problem very elegantly. Thank you. Do you have particular solutions?
Well, I'll wait for Nazia to go first. Mine is a security answer.
This is $1 million question, or maybe it's an $800 billion question. Isn't that the size of the US military budget? I mean, look, we are living in a really interesting moment. I mean, on the one hand, it is scary. I can't recall how many hurricanes and wildfires we have witnessed in the last couple months alone. And it's a very teachable moment, because in this moment, the priorities of the US state are clear. It is clear that we have $16 billion to spend on the US Space Force, that branch of the US military that Biden has pledged to give $16 billion to in this year alone. We can't raise the minimum wage $1. But as Tupac Shakur said, right, we got money for wars, but can't feed the poor. I mean, he said that in the 90s. And this is such a teachable moment. And I find it really striking. It really strikes a chord, for instance, in my classes, when we talk about the ease with which we can fund our wars. Nobody ever asks, where's the money for that when it's state-of-the-art weaponry. And now is the time to point that out. So for those of us who find ourselves in conversations, whether it's students or peers, community members, there's a real teachable moment here. The priorities of the US state are patently clear, and those priorities are militarism. I mean, I think it's brilliant and sinister how American militarism sort of hides in plain sight. I mean, you can watch a, football game, the NFL, and the Air Force will do a flyover with their newest equipment. And, you can get a list, and I urge you to go look it up, a list of movies, Hollywood films that are vetted. The scripts are reviewed by the Pentagon and by the CIA, and not just movies like Zero Dark 30, which is pretty obvious, but even TV shows like Cupcake Wars or episodes of Jeopardy that have to get CIA approval or Pentagon approval. I mean, this should give anyone goosebumps, and I think to reveal these things, to reveal the truth of American imperialism is the imperative, and it's the first step to this solution. I mean, I think a lot of folks are not aware that just this past weekend alone, in 55 cities across the country, there were protests for canceling rent debt and for expanding the eviction moratoria, things that our elected officials do not seem that concerned about, but there are mass movements in every major city across the country that are pushing for these things. And so, we can turn to those for hope, I think, in these really difficult times.
So, Nazia, Tom Cruise gets to fly F-16s, so the next movie that is coming out with Tom Cruise, he's actually flying F-16. So there is a very interesting nexus between the two. But there's also a blowback to that. Now, Chinese Air Force pilots are playing all the Top Gun tricks on American pilots. So if American jets are flying, Chinese jets are flying like this over American jets. These are tricks that are performed by Tom Cruise. I wrote a paper called Nice But Tough, recommending a US foreign policy after September 11. You can see the link I posted. So there are computer iterations which say that, so for example, the best way in which the realist and rational choice theorists argue to be able to survive is to be tit for tat. So if you are nice to me, I'm nice to you. If you are tough on me, and I'm tough on you. So if you're playing the prisoner's dilemma, for example, the best way to win the prisoner's dilemma is through tit for tat. But if I'm nice first, right, and you're playing tit for tat, then your tat will be nice to me. And so if we both play tit for tat, it'll be nice, 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 nice. But if we were playing bad, and my first move was a bad move, and you are also playing tit for tat, then our moves will be bad, 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 bad. And I think that is what has happened to the US relations with the Muslim world. So we are all going tit for tat with negative moves. So given the fact that the United States is the world's biggest country, richest power, major power, I thought that the US could reset this game and make the first move nice and then go tit for tat. So if someone responds to the nice with nice, then that's it. We have nice, 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 nice. But if someone responds in a tough way, then we can be tough. Because one of the things that we often forget is that the biggest victims of all these terrorist groups, which the US was trying to eliminate, whether it is Al-Qaeda, whether it is ISIS, whether it is the Taliban, the biggest victims of this so-called Islamic terrorism are Muslims. More Muslims have been killed by Al-Qaeda than Americans. More Muslims have been killed by ISIS and Taliban and all the other groups. So it's not as if this violence is directed at just the US or the West. This is a violence that is directed at contemporary reality. And therefore, we need to think of it. I think we need to think of extremism and terrorism the way we think of pandemics and climate change, as a global challenge that we all need to address, and not try to pin it on a civilization or on a religion. That would require an elite which is more interested in the welfare of the public rather than in just aggrandizing power and wealth in the hands of the elite.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khan. All of you have talked about the way the US government prioritizes its funding. And I wonder how much of that is sort of driven by public opinion as well. Pew has conducted a survey every year since 9/11 and found that countering terrorism is a top policy priority for a majority of Americans. Even in 2018, 73% of Americans saw terrorism as a bigger priority, as a bigger policy priority than education, the economy, and healthcare. So, I guess my question to you is, how do you what is driving this, and how do you address that that sense of fear and threat that the American public has been feeling over the past 20 years. And, with the Taliban back in Afghanistan, there's this renewed, perception of threat. So, yeah, I guess my question is, how do we address that sense of public opinion?
I'll start with that. Fear sells, right? So fear always works well. Every government leader knows that. And Trump was an aspiring authoritarian who I think the only reason he didn't turn into a dictator, he tried every move in a dictator's book, including trying to question the election results and arguably aiding and abetting, right, an insurgency to try to reverse election results. And so he used fear. And the only reason he didn't become a dictator is because of our institutions and because of our traditions and our culture and our people. But for that, I think he would have succeeded. So I think as long as the media covers fear, then you will continue to have people believe that counterterrorism is the priority. Now, the irony is that, in fact, if you look at the numbers, and I don't have them in front of me, but you can find them, for example, at the Southern Poverty Law Center, the number of people killed by right-wing extremists is actually about the same or just a little bit higher than people who claim to kill in the name of Islam. And so yet no one is afraid of them. Now, part of it is because the way racism, one of the consequences of racism is that you see a group as collectively guilty and rather than individualized responsibility. And so part of the privilege of being in the majority group or the dominant group is that you're not judged by people who do bad acts who have the same identity as you or belong to the group as you do. And if you're not in the dominant group and you're a minority group subject to racism, then you are guilty by association, right? Unless you can individually prove your innocence. So I think as long as the media continues to constantly flash ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all kinds of images of people being killed, oftentimes those people are Muslims, as Professor Khan said. They are not Americans. Then that's going to continue. But I want to go back to the point of what we can do about it. I'm a big believer in influencing the people and the places in which you have influence. And I think if everybody follows that approach, we can have quite a significant impact. The problem, people tend to feel helpless or powerless when their ambition is to change an entire country or to change an entire city or to change an entire state, which is completely unrealistic. But I think, I mean, the fact that we're all here today, right? But we each have we have our homes, we have our friends. If you're a professor, you can influence students. If you're a community leader, if you're a religious leader. And I really think that if everybody just does their part, and their part, and let's just take it at a very basic level. And as an educator, this is something that is really troubling me. We do not have an educated society. We have a society where 30% of people have college degrees and, you know, I don't know, 80%, I don't know what the percentages of people who have high school diplomas. It's relatively high, but not full. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they possess the critical thinking skills to be able to see, oh, wait, that image is actually perpetuating a stereotype, or to know how to interpret what they're being told and to be critical of it. And so I think if we each try to contribute towards those critical thinking skills by bringing the voices, like for what Mehlaka is doing today, I think is extremely important for you all to hear from our perspectives. And if I were, for example, dealing with anti-Semitism, it would behoove me not to bring in the voices of Jewish Americans and different Jewish Americans with different experiences. Because that's another problem that we have, is that when people talk about Afghanistan, how many of you have actually talked to a person from Afghanistan, right? Somebody, and with virtual Zooms and virtual meetings, it's totally possible. They don't have to come visit you in your town, but you haven't, right? And similarly with Yemen or with Somalia, or, you know, all of these Palestinians. How many of you actually talk to Palestinians? Those who have had their houses demolished, those who have to be subjected to all of the checkpoints and the roads that they can't drive on and roads that they can drive on, and all of the essentially apartheid-like, not outright apartheid living. You have to listen to them. And so this is part of, I think, the problem is, who are we actually listening to, and how do we critically think about what people are saying, including what I'm saying, right? So but I do think that if everybody does their part, we have a tremendous amount of power.
I think some of what Professor Aziz has said is so spot on, particularly about the question of schooling and critical knowledge in the US. You know, in the summer, I typically teach every summer like a K through 12 teacher training workshop. And I am often stunned, as are the social studies teachers present, by how little they often know about, for instance, the history of the Cold War, about the legacy of blowback, about the war on terror, about what followed September 11th, about this spirit of 9/12. And it leads to some really interesting conversations, right? What is the nature of critical knowledge in the US? I mean, I recently did a study of schoolroom lessons about September 11th. And typically when K through 12 learners in public schools learn about September 11th, they hear the stories of firefighters and their respiratory illnesses. They hear portraits of, you know, families who lost a loved one, and they don't really know who was behind the attacks. You know, 1 in 5 of my respondents thought Saddam Hussein was responsible for 9/11, with a few respondents suggesting Pakistan or Palestine were responsible, which should tell us a whole lot about this never forget culture and just how forgetful it is, right? That remembering September 11th has meant forgetting everything about geopolitics. So, you know, Mehlaka's question about public opinion is such a good one, because I think we can problematize public opinion itself as something that is not fixed, but is produced. Folks who haven't yet should definitely read John Stockwell's book. And John Stockwell was a CIA agent who quit in order to blow the whistle on what they were up to in Vietnam and Laos. And his interviews, some of them are on YouTube, you won't sleep at night, I will say that. And he talks about the cozy relationship sort of created between the Central Intelligence Agency and journalists to sort of influence news media. And I don't just mean, Fox News, I mean, NPR and the Washington Post and sort of liberal media itself as an arm of the US intelligence apparatus and the security state. I was really stunned this year on Oscar Sunday when the Department of Defense tweeted, "Did you know the Department of Defense vets most Hollywood movies?" And I was like, okay, well, I knew that part. I've been reading about it for a while. But for me, what was stunning is they could say that out loud on Twitter and there weren't riots in the streets afterward. So what do we mean by public opinion, and how is public opinion produced to reflect, the desires of empire is a really important question.
I wonder whether the person who tweeted that is still in their position or not. I have a slightly different take on this, and I think that it has got to do with how Americans think about America's role in history and in the world. So this whole idea of manifest destiny, God created us to promote God's values. And so it is our manifest destiny to go from coast to coast, and then it is our job, white man's burden, to bring civilization to all the brown and black people all over the world, and all of these kind of things. So there is this messianic perception of the role of the United States to go and save. So that's why, if you notice, all of American heroes, whether it's Superman or Batman or every Tom, Dick, and Harry, is saving the universe and the planet, right? They're not saving little people in Harlem or here in Delaware. So that is a cultural thing, and it has been ingrained for centuries. I don't know what's going to happen. But I have some bad news for you. We are at a very interesting juncture. And one of the explanations that a British analyst advanced for US withdrawal from Afghanistan was not because the US lost, etc. It's just that the US is now collecting all its marbles to play with China, which means we are entering a new phase of a Cold War with China. And so the $800 billion defense budget may become $1.2 trillion because China is not the Soviet Union. When the US was in a Cold War with China, with the Soviet Union, the US at one point had 50% of the global GDP. And along with the Europeans, it was 60 or 70%. And during the entire Cold War, the Western Alliance had more than 50% of the global GDP, and Soviet Union never had more than 12.5% of the global GDP. It was no contest, really. The US kind of created a fake threat and then created this massive military industrial complex. And so, but China is not the Soviet. Its economy is much bigger. It has 1.3 billion. It'll be a much more tougher opponent than the Soviet Union. And China has something that the Soviet Union did not, a global diaspora. So there are countries like Singapore and others, wealthy ones, which are like diasporas of China. So if there is a massive Cold War out there, you can bet on it that the US is trying to spend money. There's also another way to think of the US military spending. It is also a kind of subsidy. It also subsidizes certain aspects of US economy. Lots of people who didn't even have high school degrees got $30,000 signing amount and got to join the military and go to Iraq and other places. So in some ways, I have professors here in my engineering college and scientific who are horrified when they see my teaching load and say, "You teach 2 and 2? They're like, they can't believe that I teach 2 and 2. Like one of my engineering friends who said, "I want to take one of your classes, send me your syllabi." So I sent him 4 syllabus and saying, I'm teaching these 4 classes this year. And then he responded by saying, "Oh, in the last 6 years, I have not taught 4 classes." Because he has huge defense contracts. He monitors oceans and this and that. So there's a subsidy of universities, subsidy of certain segments of this. Remember that big gun they were trying to build at the time of George W. Bush, $1 billion gun, which was creating jobs in Alabama and Mississippi. I don't know what they were going to shoot with that big gun. But anyway, it was supposed to be a cannon with some 20-mile range. So in some ways, many senators and congressmen use the military budget as a way to subsidize public works, etc. I mean, I would be so thrilled if the US military decides that it's in the US national security to build a great railway system in the US. Can you imagine, why can't we have super fast trains, you know, like this, 4 hours to LA, 3 hours to Chicago? That is in our national interest. So I think that I don't think we're going to spend less on defense. There are lots and lots of people, even immigrant and even brown people, who are direct beneficiaries of the US empire. And so they will sustain this US empire. The question is, how can we tweak it in such a way that it does more good than bad?
Great. I would also encourage people to please write your questions. You know, we'd love to hear more from you, from our audience. We have a very active audience, many activists, many amazing people who are leading movements here in Western Massachusetts and around the country. So if you have a question, please do write it. I'm also just wondering now, I mean, you know, just sort of going back to who is considered a national security threat. And I'm wondering whether with, you know, the events of January 6th, I mean, we all know that, you know, the countering violent extremism budget under the Obama administration, and even before, it was mostly targeting American Muslims. But now with this sort of renewed focus on white supremacist violence, and Sahar, you said, I mean, I think this, over the past 20 years, the numbers that we have, I think there were about 107 Americans killed here in the US from those who were inspired by Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and around 114 killed by right-wing nationalists, right? So do you think with this renewed sort of focus on white supremacist violence, we are going to see somewhat of a shift domestically in who is considered a threat and how the government is going to address that?
Can I add to that question, Mehlaka? See, you remember this guy who went into the South Carolina church and shot 8 or 9 African Americans? He was never charged as a domestic terrorist. He was charged with 9 counts of murders. So a lot of people who do commit terrorist acts are not charged as terrorists. So a lot of data, statistics on domestic terrorism is undercounted. So if a Muslim girl from Mississippi, high school girl, buys an air ticket to Istanbul, she is the statistics on the terrorism, right? And she goes to jail for life. But this guy goes into a church and shoots 9 people, and then we buy him the best burger he wants. And then he's not a terrorist. So I think that the official data of terrorist activities, which are euphemistically called domestic terrorists, is heavily undercounted, I think.
So let me answer the question, but first explain why that phenomena exists. But Professor Khan says, at least from the legal perspective, is there is no domestic terrorism law. There is a definition of domestic terrorism in the statute, in criminal law, but there is no statute that enforces it. So just as there is a definition of international terrorism, but there is then also a statute that enforces it. In other words, makes it illegal to engage in international terrorism. Whereas we do not have a statute that actually makes it illegal to engage in domestic. We just define it. And terrorism, there's no universal definition of terrorism. The UN can't get one out of its members because it's the cliche, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And every group of people that thought colonial rule was a terrorist in the eyes of the colonial power. So the trimmed down simplistic criteria for terrorism is politically motivated. It's the use of violence, and it targets civilians. That's it. Those are the only 3 that people can, it's kind of the threadbare. And then from there, you get a lot of dispute. So it can't be for money. It can't be for vengeance. It has to be for some political motivation. And then you can add on for the intended purposes of changing government policy or government practice, right? To coerce the government to do something. But to answer your question, Mahalaka, I do not think there will ever be the treatment of whites the same way that there are treatments of minorities, so long as whites are the dominant group. The dominant group will never pass laws or enforce laws in ways that discriminate against itself or weaken itself or take power away from itself, whoever that dominant group is. It will always treat the situation with nuance, complexity, individualization, localization, contextualization, because that's part of the privilege of being in the majority group or in the dominant group. And so while, yes, there will be some law, there is pressure on law enforcement to punish those who were responsible or participated, at least the foot soldiers, no pun intended, and not those within the Trump administration. But yes, there are efforts to hold them responsible through mainly minor criminal charges for January 6th. But the bigger, more important question is, what will the government do about the pervasive, it's not even a rise, it's the pervasiveness of right-wing extremism, right? Which overlaps quite a bit with Trump supporters. And the answer is very little. I don't think they're going to do very much, because the justification is free speech. The justification is the right to dissent. It's all this patriot talk that, well, this is what makes our country great and different from other countries, and they will not be seen or treated seriously as a threat. And I think if you look at the last 40 years, it's evidence, because these right-wing groups have been, these are essentially the heirs of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Not to say that the KKK doesn't exist anymore, but now it's kind of sprouted out into all of these groups, the Proud Boys, sovereign citizens, Christian identity. There's so many of them, right? Some of them are militia groups, anti-government. Some of them are just outright white supremacists who want to start race wars, who think that they're under siege. Some of them are under the guise of fighting critical race theory, claiming that anti-white racism is a serious racist racial problem, notwithstanding that all of the places, if you look at which group holds the most power collectively, holds the most money collectively, holds the most elected office collectively, it's people who belong to the social construction of whiteness. So there isn't really much credence to saying whites are oppressed, because at least the material consequences in the material world shows that's simply not the case. I think what's really happening is there is now starting to be a challenge to that monopoly over power and wealth. And that then is causing them to misdirect and divert those efforts and try to kind of flip the script.
I wanted to add that this white privilege, it's a white privilege not to have a statute against domestic terrorists, I think. And what is also interesting about this is that I'm reading this book called The Anarchy, written by William Dalrymple, about how East India Company colonized India and conquered a subcontinent. But what is amazing to me that many of the generals who fought for East India Company had fought against in the War of Independence in the US. And so when they lost, they were transferred to India. But their behavior in the US, they were like gentlemen in the way they treated the US rebels. And the way they treated Indians is like, oh my God, that they're not even dogs, forget about being human beings. So the deep-seated racism, you can see that in the way the British soldiers demonstrated. If you compare their behavior in the US against white opponents and their behavior against Indians in India. So this idea of you can see this even in rape cases and allegation. Oh, he's from such a good family. He has such a great future. How can we ruin his entire career? Oh, this one little drink and misbehavior. And you've seen all of this. I just read about a case about a kid in Stanford who was nearly let go by the judge. And the judge is saying these kind of things. So this kind of white privilege exists in this country. But I think there will be a point where if they are not careful, it'll become such a major security threat that the US response might then be overboard, like it was after 9/11. I mean, how long can you ignore it? Are you waiting for another domestic 9/11 to essentially face this challenge? You know, one of the interesting things that happened as a result of the withdrawal from Afghanistan is people forgot to discuss the new data on census, which has just come out roughly at the same time. And I keep looking at the data and saying, oh my God, when are these KKK and their you know, children going to see this census data, and why aren't they freaking out yet? Because the census data is essentially fulfilling the nightmare that led to all those marches in Virginia, etc., to save white supremacy in the United States. So I think that both on the international front with China and on the domestic front with the declining demographics of white people, God bless America, we are in for a really rough ride in the next few decades.
Well, on that very light note, you know, we're actually coming to the end of our program, and I just wanted to thank everybody so much. But I just wanted to give the last word to Nazia.
I just want to say one thing. I posted a link of the Patriot movie, if you remember, with Mel Gibson and his two sons.
Yes, Dr. Khan, you did post that. I'm sure people will look at it. But I just do want to give Nazia the last word to sort of sum up this program and sum up this event. And I want to, and then I'll thank everybody.
Thanks so much. You know, I guess I would just real quick say this question of terrorism policing is so interesting, and we all come from such different disciplines, right, to approach this issue. I'm really inspired by this one piece written by Professor Robin D.G. Kelly. It's called "The U.S. versus Trayvon Martin: How the System Worked." And what he does in this piece, and it's a quick, easy read, is he really kind of questions the very premises of the US sort of legal system and how it is sort of structurally connected to white supremacy and settler colonialism. And then we can sort of begin to understand why it was that Dylan Roof was taken to Burger King in a bulletproof vest by law enforcement, the same system of law enforcement that shot and killed Tamir Rice for playing with a toy gun at a playground, right? So our understanding of the very circumstances that led to the US legal system is really, really crucial here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Khan. Thank you, Sahar. Thank you, Nazia. I really appreciate all of your very, very thought-provoking analysis, insights. And our aim here at Critical Connections is to really sort of start the conversation, really sort of get people to think critically about some of these very contentious, controversial issues and have these hard conversations. And I really want to thank everybody who joined us today. And we hope that you will take this back to, and what you've learned and what you've heard back to your communities and engage critically with that as well. Thank you all so much for being here. And thank you to our amazing speakers once again.
Let's clap for Mehlika. Great job.
Thank you, Mehlika.
Thank you all so much. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Night.